and good evening to all who have joined us for our panel discussion for today. My name is Lydia-Anne, and I will be facilitating our first panel discussion of 2024. The Youth Speaking Leaders panel discussions are made possible by active citizenship and sponsored by Public Ethos Consulting. These discussions are a legacy project of the late Professor Daniel Plaatjes, wherein he wished for a place for the youth of South Africa to speak boldly and proudly and have informative conversations about the world today and the South Africa that they wish to see in the future. If you have any questions for our panelists during the discussion, the Zoom call chat room is open to the audience. Furthermore, please make use of the hashtag YouthSpeakLeaders on all social media platforms. Before I introduce today's topic, I will open the floor to our panelists to introduce themselves and give a short explanation about the importance of the youth using their voices with regards to the year's elections and policy-making issues. Mbali?
Good evening, everyone. Hi. My name is Mbali, and I am a final year law student at the University of Cape Town. I'm currently 22 years old, and I'm actually going to be voting in my first general election this year, which I'm very, very excited about. I voted in my local and my municipal, but I think it's absolutely necessary that young people take to the polls this year and vote out the policies that we don't like, the people that represent them, and our misallocation of funds. I'm a huge believer in democracy, and I feel like there's nothing more vital than us doing something that is beyond accessible, that used to be so far reaching for not only us, but also our parents and our grandparents.
Thank you so much, Mbali. Nick?
Hi there, my name is Nicholas Kruger. I am a 22-year-old queer person living in Cape Town, where I just finished my 4-year degree where I gained a BA honors in theatre and performance. And now I am in the working world. The importance of the youth in regards to voting is something that has a historical precedent for our country. Statistically, the youth as a group make up the most people that live in South Africa at this current moment in time. And so therefore, we as a group have the most power and the most people to make change, to forward change, to suggest change, to ask and demand from those who claim to lead us to build a better South Africa. With regards to the BELA bill, which we'll be discussing today in relation to the upcoming election season and the vote and the election in May, it is vitally important that we discuss and also deal with certain myths that have come out about why our government feels that there needs to be a revamp or a reworking of how we educate people in our country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. I think we're having a bit of a technical problem with Edith, so we'll be coming back to her once her network is sorted out. There's Edith. Hi, Edith. Can you please introduce yourself to the audience?
Hi, Lydia. Hi, everyone.
So an explanation of why you think that the youth using their voices with regards to this year's elections and policy-making issues is important.
Hi, my name is Edith. I'm 23. I'm a law student at the University of Cape Town. Why I think it's important, particularly for the youth, to use their voices is ultimately we inherit the political circumstances and consequences that occur today. So the decisions made by our leaders now have a direct impact on the economy, on the political infrastructure, on the economic infrastructures that we take on in the future. And I think not playing an active role in shaping that now while you have the capacity to shape it in its foundational phases would be remiss of us as the youth. We can't complain about an economy that doesn't have jobs ready for us when we finish if we don't want to take a part in the political institutions that develop our economy, that allow for the creation of jobs. So ultimately, I think that's why it's so important to not only hear from the youth and see what they would want from the future they take on, but for the youth to participate in the creation of said future.
Thank you so much, Edith. For today's panel, the panelists will be discussing the BELA bill, as noted by Nick. The Basic Education Laws Amendment of 2022, also known as the BELA bill, aims to amend certain sections of the South African Schools Act, focusing on administration and management processes at the school level. Key provisions include grade R compulsory, revising admission and language policies, addressing school disruptions, regulating homeschooling, and strengthening governance accountability. My first question is for Mbali and Nicholas. Why is the voices of young people needed in South Africa, and what is the legitimacy of their opinion, as some people say, if you don't have children, then you can't speak about the issues that affect children?
Do you want to take the floor, Nick, or can I go for it?
No.
Sorry?
You can go ahead.
Okay, cool. Thank you for that question, Lydia-Anne. I actually found it quite interesting that there was a notion that if you don't have children, you don't really get to participate in this conversation. And I wish that that was at least the logic for most political conversations, because it's really interesting that people get to administer when it is public participation is necessary to convenience them, right? So if the logic is that you don't get to speak because you don't have children, well, you don't get to speak about this policy unless you're an immigrant. Well, you don't get to speak about this policy unless you're a woman. And we don't exercise that because we live in a democratic society that values equality. And so as a taxpayer and someone who's going to contribute to this economy and the social life, God knows I could be a parent in the next 10 to 20 years. How am I not allowed to participate in a policy or conversation that could directly implicate me? And if not me, my peers, my friends, my family, I do not think that that is valid, that because I do not have children, that I do not get to participate in a democracy that actually encourages conversation, right? And the fact that the BELA bill is super important for young people to engage with, just because we have often been left out of this conversation. We have been most recently implicated by education, right? We just got out of high school. I got out of high school 5 years ago. And we're speaking about people who were educated during the apartheid regime. To be perfectly frank, I don't think that they're the ones to be speaking on the trajectory of education, how it is developed, where its falls are, where its shortfalls are, and where its, its green flags are, because we're the most closely directly implicated. And so I think, if anything, a young person's contribution to this conversation would be necessary in order for you to engage with the things that need development, what needs tweaking, what should we keep, what should we get rid of. Why wouldn't you ask the people who have gone through this experience in the service most recently, and rather reach out and not only account for their opinion, but disproportionately weigh it against the opinions of other democratic citizens that want to engage in democratic participation?
And to pick up from where Mbali left off, I completely agree with what she is saying. The fact that there is an argument to exclude certain people of a society we all form a part of, from a conversation that most recently has affected us, is downright, it's foolish, frankly. And to go back to what Mbali was saying, we've all been children once in our lives, and I'm sure we all have an opinion about what could have been done differently in our education. And that is the point that we're making, that everyone who has either been through the system or whose future will still see them through the system has something to say about what the system should be, and what the system should strive to achieve. And putting it frankly, the education system as it stands in South Africa is woefully unequipped to handle the task that it has been given. Now, there's arguments to where we can go to speak about government neglect in those sectors and why that hasn't allowed education to do what it needs to do. But there's nothing wrong with legislation being updated at some point in a system's life to reflect the new realities of the world that we find ourselves in.
Thank you so much, Nick and Mbali. Edith, what is your understanding of religion education in schools?
So I think it's started to become a bit of a controversial type of a topic, and I don't think that it ought to be. I think religion can be so central to the way that people understand themselves and the way that they understand their lives. It's so central to the way that people dignify their lives. And so I think that there ought to be made more room for the acknowledgement of religion within an educational environment. Right. If you think about it from the perspective of, as a parent, I'm sure you would like for your child to understand the value system and the ethos that shapes their world and shapes your values as a family. But I also think from a inclusive or an accommodating perspective, having schools that are mindful of the fact that Ramadan has started, and so you are fasting, and so there needs to be allocations for time in those senses, or having environments that have prayer rooms or make allotments for morning mass. I don't think it's illegitimate for people to expect that and to hope for that from their educational institutions, right? And so a complete removal of religion from educational spaces seems remiss to me. However, I think what we ought to be trying to do is to try and strike a balance between inclusivity as far as providing spaces for people to practice their religions and to feel dignified in their practices of religion, whilst also allowing for better education of a variety of other spaces. I think half of the concern for having a religion within educational spaces is that that is all that those children are exposed to, and it further entrenches thought processes and values and ideas that they already had. I think what we should maybe try and do is balancing it out, is to provide education of maybe a larger array of religious systems, of value systems, of ethoses, so that children still feel like they're receiving a holistic education while still having the religious sides of themselves accommodated and spoken to within their educational systems.
Thank you so much, Edith. The next following set of questions will be a domino set in relation to Section 28 and 29 of the Constitution. So we'll start with Nick. If you could please define for the audience, what is sex education and what is consent?
Sexual education, simply put, it's educating young people on what exactly. Give me a moment, let me gather my thoughts. Sexual education aims to equip younger people with knowledge about how to approach, scratch that, apologies. I'm going to divide it up into two sections. There's going to be one section, which I'll speak about, then the next section. The first section that sexual education is a part of, it's about teaching young people about what happens to their bodies biologically as they grow up. It's an important part of someone's education that they are given all the I'm sorry, could you pass this on to another panelist? My thoughts aren't coming.
No, it's
Thank you.
Thank you. Mbali, Edith, would either of you like to answer the question? What is sex education and consent?
Sex education is basically a course that is introduced in life orientation, or at least in life skills, to children from varying age groups that come a part of two components, which I think is what my fellow peer Nick was alluding to, is that the one component is obviously a biological education, right? So it's a sexual education of what your reproductive organs do, how they, manifest, and what it looks like to go through puberty as a young person, and biologically what sex looks like. And that's how babies are made. And then there's comprehensive sex education, which I think is more of the controversial hot topic, because parents are wary of, what age are we rolling this out? How in depth are we going into it? Like what it is that we're telling children about sex. But comprehensive sex education, at least from my understanding, is not about sexualizing children or teaching them how to have sex. It is easily about children understanding the layers of consent, the layers of gender, the layers of sexuality, and how it is that they're directly implicated into it. I think it's completely necessary, just because, you know, curtailing off the point of consent and what that is. Consent, right, is an unwavering, like, factual and definitive, enthusiastic yes into participating into a sexual act or a form of intercourse, right? That is consent. And consent is absolutely necessary because more and more people are finding themselves in the positions where they find that, you know, they're not asked for consent, or they are engaging in acts that aren't consensual. And I think it's really interesting that this does speak specifically to the BELA Bill and why this Amendment Act is so important, right? It speaks about sex education and consent as a means of children becoming knowledgeable of their rights. Firstly, you know, their bodily autonomy and what it is that they can engage in, what it is that can harm them. Because what happens more often than not when children do find themselves into these really sticky situations is that they don't have the vocabulary for it. And I can attest to the fact that being a young person who wished that I got a sexual education a little bit younger than I did, and also in a way that felt comprehensive, might have been able to lay the grounds for kids to articulate bad things that happen to them in a way that is comprehensive, in a way that is understood, right? It's not about sexualizing children. It's not about pushing that kind of agenda on them. But you need to know that with these kinds of responsibilities, you do bear, you know, responsibility as a parent to teach or at least inform your kids about the good forms of touching, the bad forms of touching, what isn't allowed, how you feel comfortable, and evidently how to consent to that if you choose to engage in it when you're old enough and it's appropriate.
Thank you so much, Mbali. Nicholas or Edith, would you like to piggyback on any of what Mbali said?
Can I come in on the topic of gender within sexual education? Thank you. So, as a queer person who identifies outside of, not even identifies, it's my personal belief that gender is a construct. It's been constructed along certain lines to define certain things, to put people into boxes where they have to adhere to certain traits, to certain ways of being, to certain lifestyles, to be that something. Now, it's important, as Mbali was saying, is that we give children a vocabulary to speak about things that they may encounter in their life. And one of the things that kids are going to encounter in their life is the fact that they may not, or the possibility that they may not feel akin to the gender that they were assigned at birth. And this, or that they may feel an attraction to a person who that is outside of what their gender has assigned to them. You know, a boy believing that the jock in the rugby team is rather attractive, or something along those lines, such silly examples. But it's those little things that education has the ability to account for, to give children the vocabulary to speak about, that only benefits them. It's not forcing people to choose one or other things, which we already do with assigned gender, but it's giving kids the chance to learn about something that they may not be familiar with and be better equipped to interact with these certain things in life. As a queer person, it would have been a game changer to know that I am not some random freak that popped up, and I'm not the only one that felt this way, that there's millions of other people like me. And what this bill can do for queer kids specifically is show them that they're not alone, that they don't have to believe that they exist in this world alone, that there are other people with shared experiences that they can relate to. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nick. Edith, how do you think, with all this discussion of the importance of it, of sex education and consent, how do you think it should be then discussed?
So I think, as my panelists have clearly touched on, there's a great deal of importance of having these conversations, right? And I think they specifically speak to experiences children are already experiencing right now. So I think half of the concern can be, let's shy away from these discussions because we don't want to expose children to experiences that they're not supposed to have had yet, when the reality is that they're having these experiences. I mean, when I was doing my research, I was finding, so in 2022, like 90,000 girls between the ages of 10 and 19 gave birth to a child between the months of March and April, right? Of March of 2021 to April of 2022, right? And this is according to Statistics South Africa. So these young girls are already experiencing these things. To deprive them of the education and the language and the vocabulary to explain what it is that's happening to them, or for them to understand what it is that they're doing and the actions that they're engaging in, would be harmful to them, and is harmful to them, as we are clearly seeing, right? So the how, I think, for me, then becomes a question of, then how do you unpack consent for children, and how do you unpack sex education, and when do you start doing those things can be half of the battle. When can be a bit difficult to grapple with. I think, I know I've had lengthy conversations with my mom about this, because a lot of my younger siblings, my younger siblings range between the ages of 12 and 17. So there can often be a bit of a discussion of, okay, when do you start talking about certain things, and when are certain things to bring up, or when are certain things appropriate? But 12 to 17 is the exact age range that I've just articulated, who are having some of these experiences, right? As far as consent is concerned, I'm of the belief that you can teach consent as soon as a child's cognizant, right? Things as simple as, can I hug you? Is it all right if mom helps you with this thing? Is it okay if I hold your hand? I think teaching children that their physical boundaries and their space and their bodies are theirs, and they have complete domain and agency over. And so it's correct of us to then ask them when we interact with those spaces for them. I think we've often perpetuated this idea that children just have to do certain things by virtue of the fact that it's expected of them. So you have to hug your auntie because your auntie is hugging, like requesting the hug of you. And you have to be in that space because you're expected to be in that space. And you have to receive the, I don't know, like shoulder tap by your teacher because that's the thing that they've deemed to be appropriate for your relationship. I think that there's a lot of agency and autonomy that we can provide to children by teaching them the language of things like consent from early on, to explain to them that they don't have to be in those engagements if they don't want to be in those engagements. And if it's not comfortable for them, they're allowed to opt out. So I think for the how in that circumstance, it's obviously tailoring the conversation depending on the level of understanding that the child is at. But it is things like, do you mind if I give you a hug? And do you know that you're allowed to say yes or no to a hug? To younger children. And for older children, it's then discussing the nuances of consent and understanding that, under certain circumstances, a person's incapable of giving us consent. I think when we entered varsity, it's so fascinating even now to see the way that people will debate about whether or not consent exists under certain circumstances. And I feel like that is the byproduct of having those conversations when people turn 19, and that's the first time we finally start talking about it. But if you understood consent as this lengthy thing that encompassed so many aspects of your life prior to just sex, and whether or not you should be having sex, and whether or not there are certain states that you can agree to have sex in, if we started having these understandings of consent earlier, we'd be able to understand those later discussions with greater nuance and understanding. So I think the how for me should be a multi-phase process where you engage with it in different ways depending on the ages of the child. Same pertains to sex education. I know children as young as 8 who can experience their period. So failing to teach about sex education until at that point, because all of a sudden they're leading, and hopefully they're encountering that in their home or in an environment where they feel safe enough to speak to the adults available to explain them and walk them through the process that they're having. But imagine that same 8-year-old who's at school or at a sleepover or at a camp, surrounded by people that they don't feel comfortable discussing something that feels traumatic in that moment in time. Like, what do they say? What is the language that they use? What tools do they have? They can't comprehend what it is that is occurring to them in that matter. And sex education encompasses those types of conversations. I think what my colleague Nick was addressing is the idea of, for queer individuals. I know I have many friends who now in their later years can say, you know what, this, and this thing that occurred to me in childhood was definitely indicative of the fact that I was queer, and I didn't understand it then because nobody taught me the language to understand it then. So much like consent, I think we ought to be approaching sex education as a multi-phase, multi-step process where you encourage discussions and understanding of different facets of it, depending on where the child is in their development. So you get to the points where you do need to start talking about things like condoms and safe sex and STIs in the works. But you don't have to have that with the grade 2, right? That's kind of my understanding as far as how we should be approaching sex education and consent.
Thank you so much, Edith. Mbali, your hand.
I wanted to lower my hand so that there was an acknowledgement that at least I got to speak. I think my colleague obviously did a rundown of everything in such actually beautiful detail, because I think I just wanted to echo all of your points. And I feel exactly the same, that at least in the approach of sex education and consent, that is layered, right? And it's also going to evolve because children evolve, children grow up. So consent is going to look different, you know, when they are cognizing what it means to hug somebody, kiss somebody, like hold hands with somebody, up until the point that they might decide to have sex because they're old enough, and that is a personal decision that they want to make. Similarly, for sex education, I do think you would be doing such a grave disservice to not rolling out something like biological reproductive sexual education as young as 8 and 9, if the average age that women are getting their periods is 9 years old. Because as Edith said, it is going to be traumatic to be experiencing that for the first time, and you haven't been given the toolkit or any kind of vocabulary to articulate what is happening to your body, and for you also to understand why it's happening. I think back on that statistic, which I thought was very profound, about the amount of unwanted teenage pregnancy has gone for being called the abortion bill, right? Speaks specifically to a specific clause that was read into as a subtext that alludes to how it is schools want to approach abortions, and actually children not getting the consent of their 5, that a child is allowed to get medical attention from the age of 12 or older without the consent of their parent, right? And it looks like you're going to the school nurse. It looks like you getting a panado. Those are things that happen without your parents' consent, right? As controversial and be that as it may, I think if you're going to do something like not give children sex education, but then be up in arms about them wanting to get abortions because they weren't taught about sex education, is ironic, right? Instead of approaching it with a resolutive structure, because ideally, in an ideal world, teenage girls in school are not getting abortions left, right, and center. But if they're doing it because they feel like it needs to be a resolutive factor to the fact that they have an unwanted pregnancy, when you could have skipped that altogether and given them preventative sexual education, they wouldn't have gotten pregnant in the first place. They wouldn't have to get an abortion in the first place. And now you as a parent are not going to be angry. You are not informed that your child was getting counseling considering abortion. If or like elimination of sex education, or wanting to be up in arms about your children getting sex education, is going to be more detrimental and destructive than it is going to be helpful, right? Because we actually want kids to get into the process of being educated so that they do know what's going on with their bodies and so that they can make the right choices. And us taking away their willingness, their bodily autonomy that young, already shows them that we don't really trust them with their bodies or their decisions. And so, like, what kind of grown-ups, what kind of adults are you making, responsible, moving people, individuals in the world, that are told that they're not supposed to trust, you know, their intuition or their bodily feelings? I think this also speaks specifically to the fact that religion in schools is a contentious issue. And I think both Nick and Edith have given such nuanced perspectives that are on either sides of the spectrum. I want to drive home the idea that, at least in some religious institutions, and I can speak from my school experience as someone who went to a religious school, abstinence was the type of sex education that was put onto me in high school. I did not get a reviewal of any type of sexual or reproductive health education from the age of 13 to 18, which I think is really detrimental considering how many of these kids, as Edith said, are already exploring their bodies as well as engaging in sexual activity. And a lot of them aren't getting the sexual education to do that. And something like abstinence is super detrimental to the fact that you're not even saying, we're not going to give you the sex education. We just plead that you don't have sex. And it's ironic because it's had the opposing reaction than it has the encouraging reaction. So you'll find that less and less kids are abstaining because they're told to abstain, versus if you'd actually given them the education to begin with, and they can actually opt out, I don't want to do it, which you would be surprised would probably be the majority of the case. But instead, you are telling a teenager or someone who's trying to find themselves in their bodies that might even be in a rebellious phase or nature, that everybody is telling them what to do all the time, that I actually don't want you to do XYZ with your body. I think it's unfounding, especially since there is space for sex education to be taught in religious schools, be it in a comprehensive way or be it in a reproductive and biological way. Mind you, the comprehensive way is purely a focus on physical relationships, which is so necessary because children should be taught about relationships, physical relationships, as young as they are having relationships, like physical relationships, be it with their parents, be it with their grandparents, their friends, their family. I know it's a really hard truth, but I think out of ignorance, there is a huge dismissiveness of the fact that instances of assault and trauma that happen to young children, at least sexually, happen in their communities with the people that they trust the most. So do you not understand how detrimental and risk-taking it is for you not to want to teach your child about consent or not ask them if they want that hug? They don't need to sit on that uncle's lap if they don't want to, right? And these are all of the kind of pressures that you're pushing onto them from as young as that they can remember, so they feel like people have an entitlement to their bodies. And so when we find ourselves in compromising positions, that's where the victim blaming comes in. That's where, people don't come forward. And that's not what we want. We want to encourage a nature in society where we're all respective of our own bodies and of other people's. So we're not going to touch them if they don't want us to. And kids are allowed to express that from as young as they want to as old as they want. Otherwise, you're doing a disservice to your children. And that might be a hard pill to swallow, especially for the parents. I personally am so thankful that I'm not a parent. I think there are so many qualms and issues in society that I can understand how something like the BELA bill would raise flares. However, if anything, this should be the opportunity for you to engage in a conversation. That is so necessary, because remember, amendments like this do not come every 2 years. It's every 10 years. It's every decade or so. And the world is going a lot quicker than our legislature. And so things like gender, as Nick has alluded to, and things like consent, as Edith has alluded to, are necessary to be spoken about right now. Because if you'd rather wait, then the next time we're going to have this conversation are when the four of us are parents. And by then, the world would have been spun on its toes and there would have been far more pressing issues that need to be contributed to this conversation.
Thank you so much, Mbali. Edith, but from what you said, like the irony of it all and the conversations of how young you can have these conversations with your kids, what I remember very vividly as you were explaining, Edith, is that I remember in grade R, we were already having the conversation of marriage. But the irony of it all is very interesting. And then I think you also raised a very important note, Mbali, about how amendments like this only come every 10 years, which means that we should be a part of this conversation as youth, because in 10 years' time, if we'd like to, we will be the parents that will be looking at this amendment once again. So if anything, we should be the ones having this conversation. Edith, if you'd like to raise your hand, but also like to ask you maybe another question. I think you kind of like touched on it, but in terms of like the role of parents in relation to the school and the state and their social contract with the government as parents and their control of the curriculum. If you could touch on that with your...
Sure, because I think that actually ties in quite perfectly with what I was going to say, because it's deeply ironic, and I think to those of us whose sense of humor could fall that way, very funny to think that a lot of the controversy around the BELA bill is essentially fear-mongering for contents that it does not have. So as amazing as it would be for us to be able to say, you know what, Parliament is trying to have this very progressive conversation and discussion about the education, sex education for students, and consent and religion, and the reality of the BELA bill is it doesn't say any of those things, right? So the bill isn't trying to push for sex education in schools, and the bill isn't trying to mitigate the impact of religion in institutions. It's not even trying to eradicate language and the usage of languages outside of English in our institutions. The bill, for the most part, is administrative, right? It's saying, you know what, if you're going to make certain decisions or certain adjustments to your curriculum or the way that your school's policy is structured, you have to run that through government, or you have to run that through your school's governing board, right? Those aren't decisions that automatically say that we're going to have sex education for the youth, even though I would argue, and I think my panelists amongst have clearly articulated, that we would argue that we should. So whilst intending to shut down conversations, progressive conversations around sex education and consent, they've almost ignited them where the bill was never trying to do that to begin with. But I think what the bill does speak to is that relationship between parents and the state, because I think a lot of the outcry that we've seen right now has kind of just been this idea of, well, the government is intruding on my capacity as a parent, particularly with regards to the homeschooling clauses. I think I've written down in my notes here which clause that is. Clause 3 specifically speaks to governing bodies and the responsibility for learning attendance. Clause 2 talks about compulsory grade R. I've unfortunately misplaced the clause that regards to homeschooling, but the fact that you have to register any child who is receiving some form of alternative schooling that doesn't occur within an institution. And I think a lot of parents' outcry with regards to this is kind of just the belief that the state is trying to force them to do things that they don't want to do. So one of the articles that I was reading, there was this Sotho mom who was saying, well, you know what, in the schools, they're not offering the opportunity for my child to learn Sotho, and that's their home language. And I think it's important for my child to be raised in their home language, because how else do we maintain culture? And I could sympathize and empathize with the plea of that parent, because I can obviously say we ought to be teaching more of our official languages within the institutions and schools. But at the same time, the bill isn't trying to eradicate that parent's capacity to do that, right? The bill is ultimately saying we as the state have an overarching guardianship over every child that exists within the country. And our job then is to ensure that these children have homes, have some form of shelter structure, they have access to their basic needs. So your food, your water, your electricity, your healthcare, and we're making sure that they're educated, right? We're understanding that as far as capacity to engage socioeconomic education is crucial. So making sure that children are being educated, making sure that all children are being educated is incredibly important for the state to do, and is a mandate that we ought to be expecting the state to do. So when they say, okay, just register with us that you are homeschooling your child, and we can ensure that it's, and the bill literally articulates to the best interest of the child, because that's ultimately the only concern. The concern is saying, fine, if you've decided that our systems don't work to the way that you would like for them to, and there's a myriad of different reasons for why people opt to homeschool, but if you've decided that our systems don't take care of your child the way that you would like for them to be taken care of, that's perfectly all right. Just please quickly articulate to us how you are going to be doing things differently, and show us that you are in fact going to be doing things differently. I know I was watching this video essay about the homeschooling system in the States, and they have similar legislation that just basically speaks to registering as a homeschooled parent and ensuring that the state knows that you're doing that. But the discourse there about is whether or not different syllabus and curriculum should be enforced on students, even in homeschooled environments, because the concern is that you have parents who are willfully not teaching children everything that they're supposed to know. And I think that's a similar concern we can find here. So as much as I should be able to have the agency to teach my children the way that I would like to teach my children, it's then also the state's responsibility to say, sure, fine, do that. However, your child needs to know how to read and write. Your child needs to know how to do basic arithmetic. Your child needs to be able to engage with society when they turn 18. And there are certain educational benchmarks that are required for that. We need to make sure that your child is receiving all of those tools for them to reach those certain academic and educational benchmarks, so that they are not removed from their capacity to uplift themselves. And I think the BELA bill and its ability to better regulate that system and to regulate that care that we ought to be showing to kids and that we ought to be providing to kids is commendable from Parliament's state. But I don't think it's the removal of autonomy or agency that parents think that it is.
Thank you so much, Edith. Nick, your hand.
Thank you. I'll be brief because Edith got to it. It's that whole idea about where this fear mongering around the bill is coming from, around certain things that the bill does not actually speak about in any sort of fact. And Edith and Mbali's characterization of the bill as administrative, and I call it bureaucratic, is quite on point, because that's exactly what it is. Like Edith says, it's about running by the government what you plan to do with the child's education. And dare I say, I'm getting the feeling that a lot of the vitriol and the misinformation that comes from the bill is already coming from parts, be it schools or parties with specific agendas, or frankly parents who aren't already doing the things that our education system is asking, is providing for, such as we were speaking about earlier, sex education and certain other educations on certain topics that should be given to a child throughout their life. It sounds like a lot of the misinformation is being spread by people who fear that they may no longer have the ability to run wild with how they want to give their child an education. It's government, as Edith put it, recognizing that in this society that we fall under, in the social compact we all, to an extent, consent to, we have to make sure that the children that are a part of the country, the part of the South Africa we all live in, are best equipped to move forward. And if that means that everybody has to move through a certain bureaucratic structure to start filtering out the places and the spaces and the people that aren't doing that, then I can only say that yes, that this is a bill that we should be supporting and having a conversation about.
Thank you so much, Nick. And I think with all of you, what you've touched on, all of your responses, is that this is a conversation that we should be having, because that is what makes like our constitution so strong, is that everything that we have done in order to build our constitution is that it's through discussion. We discuss how we feel, and that's how then you also contribute by voting as well. We become stronger as a country by discussing exactly what's happening in our country. So the question that I would like to ask next is, what important message would you like to share with citizens about religion or sex education, and what kind of messages they get in relation to the BELA bill and the elections coming up where political parties play games and electorate? Would anybody like to take that question? It's quite heavy. Thank you, Edith.
I think, if nothing else, so kind of walking you through my own process here in preparations for today. So obviously first hearing all of the controversies around the BELA bill. So then I went, okay, I think it's the law student in me. I went, okay, fine, let's open up this. It's not legislation yet, but let's open up this bill. Let's see what it says. And let's actually walk through step by step what it articulates, what it hopes to amend. And then realizing that it was such an administrative and bureaucratic bill, and that for the most part, it was just kind of refining how we regulate the employment of different school administrators and staff, and the running of different school institutions. So then it went, okay, so where are all of these controversies coming from? Because it's not the bill. The bill doesn't say any of those things. And if it's not the bill that's saying these things, what interests are being peddled and whose interests are being peddled when we push certain narratives about legislation that isn't even legislation yet, but doesn't say those things, right? And I think ultimately what the BELA bill does is it acts as a red light, a flashing red light as far as going into this election, and what I think I would like people, and what I hope people would remain cognizant of. I think as we walk into an age of AI, clickbait, misinformation, and just run-of-the-mill like rage baiting, is that I think people need to be a lot more discerning with the information that they take in, as particularly because we're on the precipice of an election, right? There are lots of powerful parties and interests and people who benefit from us being upset and focusing on issues that aren't issues, right? When you are focusing on a BELA bill that doesn't say any of the things that you're being told the BELA bill says, there's something else happening in the background that you are being instructed that you're being convinced not to pay attention to, right? Or there are political parties or political interests that are trying to appease you because of something else they did, and they're using a controversy that doesn't exist in order to dissuade you from a different direction, right? There are numerous different reasons to vote for or against certain parties, but I think finding information that is based in fact and finding reasons that are based in truth should be the primary goal of any voter going into this election. So I think what I would hope people take away from this BELA bill incident is just read everything and the source material. If you're hearing about some WhatsApp thread that's going across and you're seeing some sort of WhatsApp video, I know my family members are particularly guilty of this. But if you're seeing some sort of like WhatsApp video that claims X, Y, and Z is occurring, research that. I know I can be guilty about that with regards to Twitter and Instagram. There are things that I'll see where I'll go, oh my goodness, I can't believe that's happening. And then a couple days later, if I'm lucky, someone else will point it out to me and they'll say, hey, love, you just put that on your Instagram story. I'm telling you right now, take it down because it's not true. Or it's a narrative that's being pushed with regards to this issue so as to disempower people, to convince people of a status quo that isn't true. Going into the election, engaging with global politics as it is, because there's so much happening on the global stage right now, it's so important that people understand the importance of researching information for themselves and finding sources that they know that they can trust, or finding a myriad of sources that hopefully can reflect information. If one source becomes compromised, if you are looking at 5 and those 4 others are not affirming what that one source is saying, at least then you're able to find that out and identify that. I think if nothing else, the way that we engage with elections going forward is just a lesson in critical engagement and critical research. It's going to become harder and harder to discern what is true and what is not, particularly because of AI, particularly because of clickbait, particularly because of false news. We then, as voters and as electorates, need to become a lot more discerning and a lot more critical with the way that we engage with media and information.
Thank you so much, Edith. Mbali will come to you, but I also would like you to touch a bit more on how people in our generation, as the youth ourselves, will say, oh, I don't know who to vote for because I don't know who's saying what, as if the information's not there and either saying a lot about the source material, like go and look. If in your response, if you could please also touch on that. Thank you.
I think this one's quite interesting because I've also been reveling in the idea of not me personally knowing who to vote for in the general election. And I think that's rich coming from somebody who's been telling everybody to register to vote, and could not emphasize it enough how important it is. However, I do think that is a cop-out because this generation specifically does get a rep for being apathetic, that we don't really care because, the system has failed us, the country has failed us, and there are no odds of us getting out of it. And I think there is actually a plethora of information, and I also think a lot of it is accessible because I do find that the ones who are complaining about not really knowing who to vote for are the ones who have the information at their disposal. I think similarly to what Edith spoke to about the fact that, people are, misconstruing resources and they don't really use their critical thinking to question, is this real? Is this legitimate? These are the people who have access. The people who don't have access are not the ones spreading misinformation. You think that's a coincidence? Like, I think similarly, if you're somebody who knows what your values are, if you're somebody who just, cares about climate change, cares about employment, there's a party that speaks directly to one of the policies that you hold true to yourself, or at least that you're concerned about. I can guarantee it, really, put money on it. It is, though, a matter of engaging with it, reading a manifesto, maybe going to a rally, speaking to student representatives. I know, especially in a university space, we are so lucky, and we shouldn't take it for granted, that a lot of the party chapters, the student chapters, are on our campus. And they are more than happy to talk to you about what it is that their manifesto is, whatever it is that their party wants to accomplish in the general election. You can Google, you can go to TikTok, Instagram, WhatsApp. Again, these are all privileged exercises of access to information, but these are the very people who are complaining they don't have access or that they don't know who to vote for, right? I think it would be far more difficult if you didn't have access to internet, if you maybe lived in a rural town or village. I think democracy and honestly, our country needs to do a better job at trying to make that kind of thing accessible to people, because even things like voters' rights are very much a developed world, first world like problem. People aren't necessarily up in arms about whether or not that pothole gets fixed on their road if they're not eating, if their tap isn't working. And there's layers to this. And I think the people that we need to be prioritizing are the ones that have their socioeconomic rights disenfranchised, not exercised, not realized. Those are the types of people you need to be thinking about in this election. You cannot just reduce it to your own personal agendas, because we live in a democracy. And so unfortunately, whether you like it or not, whatever policies do roll out are going to affect everybody and anybody, and you need to think about how that affects it. I don't know if that answers your question, Lydia, because I did want to also, perfect, because I also wanted to speak to what Edith was talking about. I think it's specifically interesting that your original question, at least, Lydia, it was about religious schools and sex education. Am I right? I think that that's really interesting because there is a space for religion, I think, in education, or at least from the position of community. I personally am not religious, but I can value that there is a beautiful sense of community and belonging in religion, and something that grounds you and something that makes you feel anchored in a purpose or a value system. I think that's so necessary, whatever form that value system looks like and comes in. I think, however, that people conflate the two issues with one another. And I would like to remind people that these things are not, well, that they are actually mutually exclusive. And so two things can exist at once. And so you can have a religious school and you can have a sex education. And I think everybody's too busy trying to tiptoe off of the qualms of what it is that you want to allow, disallow in that. It can be very harmful to be dismissive of or not allow your children's exposure to a sexual education just because they go to a religious institution. Because there are also religious schools that are doing a phenomenal job at rolling out sex education. And I can't speak to the experience on it, obviously. Like, I was also looking at the BELA bill and I was like, where is all of this talk about sexual education and getting rid of religion? I think, if anything, like Edith did say, it hones in on a lot of the actual important things that we should be talking about. So if anything, these Karens who have misinterpreted information have done us a favor. It's brought a lot of really important conversations to the forefront. And I know that wasn't even their agenda. And at least in a general election, like Edith did say, I would love to emphasize the fact that you ought to use your critical engagement, because that can't even be reduced to somebody being uneducated. Like, I used this metaphor earlier, but children as young as 3 years old are practicing their critical thinking. When you tell them no, what do they say? Why? And I think, like, why aren't we asking each other those questions? Why aren't we saying why? Why aren't we saying how? Why aren't we questioning, the system and the bill that's being reenacted and why it's being enacted? Why is it amended? The institute, I think this was first instituted in 2022, if I'm not mistaken. That's its initial drafting. And that is the time that it started a lot of its engagement. However, I think it is specifically taken a light because a general election is coming up. And like Edith did say, these political parties benefit so much when we are too busy arguing over menial contentious issues. And this is menial. This is administrative. This is bureaucratic. If I could get into the details of how it had to go to the NCOP and then the NA and then public participation. So they have to rent out halls in every other province and get everybody to participate and make it accessible for you to participate in that. That is the legal, bureaucratic bogus that I could bore everybody with. That is what you should be having an issue with, right? What you are having an issue with is a falsity. It is something that doesn't exist. It doesn't cease to exist. There are more pressing issues that we could be engaging with, but it's okay, because even if you do look at a lot of the propaganda that is pushing against this BELA bill, I want you to check the resources that are posting it. And I'm not going to add the websites. I'm not going to add the organizations, because you can also check who those websites and those organizations are funded by and ran by. So all of this is a political chess game. It has nothing to do with children. It has nothing to do with religion. It has nothing to do with sex education. I think, if anything, it's an accessory to the whole thing. I think you get to embellish it with the fact that you really care about your children. If you really care about your children, read the Children's Act. A lot of the stuff that isn't actually in the BELA bill is instituted in the Children's Act, and you haven't had an issue with it since 2005. It was written in 2005, and we haven't heard about one amendment since. I think if there's anything that this country does get right, at least it's in our reform of legislation and our commitment to try and be as democratic, as progressive, as forward-thinking as we can on paper. Whether or not we've realized it is 1,000% a different conversation, and I cannot dismiss that, not at all, right? But I think if there's anything that we have done, it's on paper, is create the space for this discussion, is create the space for this development. And if you're going to be up in arms about things that don't exist, you run the risk of losing the things that you do actually really value, which might actually be taken for granted in this coming election. So you ought to push that energy into doing your research about who it is you're going to vote to, and making a considered effort to vote for someone that is going to make a difference.
Thank you so much, Mbali. Nick, before you respond, I would just like to open again to the audience. If you have any questions for our panelists, or any opinions that you'd like to share, please put so in the chat box, either on Facebook or on Zoom. Thank you, Nick.
Lydia-Anne, could you repeat the question quickly, just so I have a clear understanding?
So what important message would you like to share with the citizens about religion and sex education, and the kind of messages that get in relation to the BELA bill and the elections coming up? So essentially the controversy of what's happening around the BELA bill. Yeah.
Okay. Firstly, I'd like to praise my panelists for beautifully articulating exactly the response to the question. Everything that I may say might end up just echoing what they said, because they have clearly laid out what people should be thinking about in regards to this bill. I think what I want to say is that democracy works through participation. And the only way we can participate is if we are informed. So first things first, Facebook is not a source. Twitter is not a source. Instagram's pretty little slideshows are not a source. They are something we can use to begin informing us of something, but it is everybody's responsibility to critically think about the information that is being presented to them, and ask the questions about, as my fellow panelists have said, why is it being presented to them? By who is it being presented to them? Why now is it being presented to them? And where are we that this is a pressing issue that is being presented to them? And also, how is it being presented to them? Because the how comes up with an interesting conundrum of, why are we even talking about sex education, about the BELA bill, when it doesn't even talk about sex education? When, as my panelists have said, it is all about amending the administration of how the government serves education in the country and ensuring that it does it in an effective way. It's legislation and I'm losing the word, but when we rewrite legislation and when we look at legislation again and amend it, it's a natural part of democracy. And from now until the point you move on with your life, you will encounter referendum after referendum and after referendum. And these are opportunities where we get to participate in what the law says about us and what the law allows us to do and how the law can benefit us. So then the next thing I wanted to speak about is one thing we need to hold government accountable for is presenting this information in a way that is accessible to everybody. I had the privilege of attending university where I could go to a political rally held by the ANC Youth Wing or the EFF Student Command or those DA people. about whatever they want to talk about. But that kind of participation with the democracy we all claim to exist in isn't a reality for millions of South Africans. In fact, I'd wager to say that the government and the other political parties won't even venture out to inform these South Africans, and governments specifically, because they can get away with relying on a vote that is, to some degree, and I say this with a grain of salt, uninformed, as to what Mbali was talking about earlier. Until your basic needs are met, you can't. There's no the ability to participate in democracy is much reduced by that fact when you're worrying about so many other things. And as the economy and as the world continues to chug on, where things are getting more expensive, where inflation is increasing, this realm of not being able to participate in democracy kind of slowly creeps up, where more and more people can't have the space to participate in it because they're starting to worry about the things that matter to them most. But if we say we live in a democracy where participation means we get to have a say, it has to become something that we go out of our way to participate in. And now, once again, I can say this from my standpoint, and my position is that it's easy for me to decide to go off and do these things. But there are mechanisms in place. They aren't perfect. I believe they could change. But it's something that we have to do. And we as the youth fit in this interesting place where we are being told that we are apathetic. We don't know what we're doing. We don't have any place in these sort of discussions. But it's only because people see us as the youth. Like, what does that even actually mean? And yeah, that's what I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nick. Edith, I'm coming to you. Just something I would like to point out as well is that I always find these panel discussions that we do so important, because when we speak about the youth, people think that we're speaking about like the youth as in you turn 25 and then you go higher, and then as soon as you get to a certain age, like 40, 50, then you're still youth. But when we're speaking about youth, we're speaking about the young people who can completely understand the history of the world and the history of the politics of South Africa, and how important it is for us to like have discussions such as this about the future that we will be stepping into. And coming with that as well, coming from the country that we come from, the cries, the strikes, everything that happened, the place that we got to now was not because of the older people, it was because of the youth, and how important it is for us to have this conversation. So with this conversation now about political parties, and the elections coming up, Edith, could you touch on the importance of the youth, please?
So I actually had the amazing privilege and to attend a discussion being held by Mbali and Tuli and her new organization that she started up. I'm completely blanking its name. Just give me a second. But what she was talking about was the different political interests that were being vested in people going to vote, and whether or not people, it's called Groundwork Collective. Sorry, I mind blanked. But she was talking about the different political interests that are being pushed when you choose to and not to vote. And I think people often think of that as being a decision you're making completely independently and you're not being swayed to feel that way. And she was talking about how there is money being spent, and lots of it, and there are political analysts and so psychologists and sociologists who are working in the background to identify how to encourage certain subsets of the population not to vote, or how to encourage certain subsets of the population to vote. And if they've identified you as a person who's not going to vote in the direction that they want you to vote in, then they're going to try and encourage you not to vote. Because it's better to have only the people who support me go out and vote at the polls, and the people who don't support me to stay at home, right? So as the youth, I think we often lean on this idea of, no, we're apathetic because nothing's changing and nothing around us seems to be happening. The majority of the country fall within the youth. If you think about that 18 to 35 demographic is where the majority of our population sits. If we were to all sit down and say, you know what, actually we're all going to go and get registered and we're all going to go and vote, we could swing an election. We could, if we'd all identified one party and decided that was the who we were as the youth supporting, we could swing the election based on our vote alone, right? There's so much power and agency to be had in the youth. And so there's a lot of incentive from people, particularly who aren't creating policy that helps and empowers the youth, to discourage us from voting in the first place, to encourage us that nothing changes so that there's no point, to encourage us that the youth vote and the youth voice has no place in the 2024 election, right? So I think when we start thinking about things like apathetic and apathy, I think we need to think very critically about who is perpetuating this idea that we shouldn't care or that nothing changes or that nothing can be done, right? And then on idea that one of my that's Nick brought forward of that we are privileged enough to have or fortunate enough to have right now is that it's interesting that there are parties who will go out and speak to them, and for those subsets of the populations they'll only hear about 1-2 of the political parties on the ballot present, and they'll think they only have 1 or 2 options, right? I think that then calls on us as the youth to try and see what we can try and do. Granted, I'm only 23. I am not working. There's only so much I can do. There's only so many resources that I have. But I think that there's an obligation and a duty on us then to educate as many people as we can in whatever capacities that we can about the variety of different options. I think you don't have to be in those rural environments to also be caught up with the idea that you only have 2 or 3 options, because I've heard peers in my own lecture venues and my own classrooms and my own social circles say the exact same thing. And all I could think to myself is, there are more than in the last national election, there were 58 parties on the ballot. We have now included independents. I'm pretty sure there has been the emergence, not even I'm pretty sure, I know that there's been the emergence of new parties since then. So we have plus 58 parties on the ballot. You cannot possibly feel like of 58 options, not a single one of them represents an interest that you have, a political feeling that you feel inclined towards, right? The options exist, and apathy and the feeling that nothing changes shouldn't be the reason you don't investigate further. You have access to the tools to do that. And once you've accessed those tools, you have the obligation and the civic duty to help other people to know about them as well, right? I think what we need to encourage, particularly for the youth vote and their engagement with political parties, is a sense of agency, a sense of determination. There's more that you can do for this country and yourself as far as going forward than just planning to leave. You can understand how the institutions work. You can understand what it is that we need to do to change the political frameworks that we are working with. And you can understand who the political players even are. Who are the funders? What does it mean that Oppenheimers are involved in every single one of the political parties? Who are they? What do they do? What interests do they represent, right? I think utilizing those tools and utilizing those social platforms and utilizing the internet accesses that we have for a constructive discussion about politics and encouraging a greater sense of agency in our politics is what we as the youth ought to be trying to do.
Thank you so much, Edith. Nick?
Thank you. I wanted to speak about politics and democracy. And the tricky thing about it is that in 5 years after now, in 2029, we will have another general election. And we'll be having a similar conversation to encourage people to vote, or for their own interests, which aren't always clear to the voter. What I want to say is that with the current system we exist in, and no, I don't want to say that change takes time. I want to say that the smaller parties, yes, they're not going to win the national election. There's none of the predictions or none of the guesses that can be made will say that one of the smaller parties is going to win the election and unseat the ANC from their 20+ year winning streak. But that being said, if we want a new government, if we want a new political dispensation, it's something that requires patience with the system that we're currently in. And what I mean by that isn't waiting for something to happen, but it's constantly working towards that future you want. It means showing up for however many years it takes with people that you believe in want to make a change and getting them into government. It means not vote. It means that this year, for example's sake, let's say that I'm just going to use a party that doesn't exist for the sake of the example, the Green Party. Let's say I want to vote for the Green Party because I'm an environmentalist. I am going to sit down and decide for myself that I need to support this party until they have the political sway to do something about to do something about anything. And that means I'm not only voting for them in this election, it means thinking ahead. It means when 2029 rolls around, I'm going to be voting for them in that election, and then in the election after that, and then in the regional elections that happen in between that. It means that one election, and I must say, it is odd that it only happens every 5 years, isn't going to change the entire landscape in one day. It's something that we have to commit ourselves to doing for a while until a change can come, until we have built up the momentum for something new to come into the political landscape and change something. So what I want to say is that don't lose hope if the elections that are coming up don't get the result that you want. It's not the only election you will have in your lifetime, and it's not the only election that South Africa will have in its lifetime. It is a long game. It is a very frustrating game, but it's something that to an extent works and has worked in the past. That being said, we should probably have elections more often for certain things, but yeah, that's what I have to say.
Thank you so much, Nick. I think with that, it also then comes with the understanding that the people that you're hearing from the most is not the only people that are there to vote for. I think that's essentially the main thread that I've seen through Nick and Edith's point, is that there's way more that you can look for, and the resources are there for other parties, for other political people. And now that we're allowing independents to also be on the ballot sheet, there's more that you can say. You can, your position, your opinion, your voice will be heard in some form because of how many opportunities, how many parties there are on the bill. So that also becomes a huge discussion as well. We have not received any questions from the audience so far. So I think it's appropriate for us to then close up the discussion for today. I would like to thank you so much to Servant Leadership and Public Ethos Consulting for allowing this discussion to take place. Thank you to our wonderful audience for joining us, and thank you to our 3 panelists for their thoughts and opinions of the BELA Bill. I was your host, Lydia-Anne, and I wish you a brilliant year further. Thank you so much.